This is crazy. There's a lot of people to just sit here and listen to me talk about music theory for a long time. Typically, when I tell people I study music theory here, they give me one of two responses, and the first is, "Oh my God, I didn't know you could study music theory here," and the second is, "Oh my God, I hate music theory." And so this is kind of my response to both of those, I guess. We'll get the thanks out of the way, because once the show gets going, it gets going. Thank you all so much for being here. This is amazing. We have my mother and my father here, wherever you are. Everyone in this band is absolutely incredible. We also have my thesis committee here. We got Roger and Felicia.
Hey.
Thank you so much. And of course, we have the illustrious Andrew Sharpman, my advisor. It's been an amazing 2 years, and it's a shame that I just have such a short time to learn from you, because I feel like I could learn from you for years and years to come, but all right, I'll be doing enough talking, so let's get the show started. Chapter 1, Introduction. On July 29th, 2020, pop superstar Beyoncé released her 7th studio album to international rapture as it near immediately broke the record for most streamed album in a single day. Provocatively entitled Renaissance, the album revolves around an equally provocative concept: a love letter to dance music and a musical dissertation of its history. Dance music may seem quite vague in meaning. After all, people have been waltzing and sarabanding for centuries, yet Beyoncé ignores these styles and their history outright. Rather, the dance music that Renaissance highlights is taken from the cultural powerhouse of intersecting Black and queer circles. A single ancestry unifies the many styles of dance music on this album, which include house, dancehall, hip-hop, and trap, to name a small selection. These musics and countless others owe their widespread fame and success to their loving gay uncle, disco. Neither is Renaissance an isolated case of disco in the mainstream culture, nor is it patient zero. In fact, as of writing this, disco is frankly unavoidable, with an international grasp expanding from gigantic disco album releases by Kylie Minogue, Jessie Ware, and Dua Lipa in 2020, to recent disco Eurovision Song Contest submissions by Latvia, Slovenia, and Iceland. Curiously, many other earlier styles of popular music, including rock, Motown, and jazz standards, hold minimal relevance in the global pop music of today. I postulate that a connection between arts and culture is automatic and indivisible. Consequently, two similar arts, especially those that share a direct evolutionary line, suggest a similarity in the cultures from which they originate. Thus, we must explore the culture that oversaw the genesis of disco in the 70s to determine its similarities to today. Disco was born from the club scenes in large U.S. cities in the 1960s, particularly from an intersection of Black, Latino, and gay communities. Its name derives from its place of origin, the discotheque, even though disco itself may refer to the music, the movement, and the clubs themselves. Known for its four-on-the-floor beats, heavy syncopated bass line, and consistent percussion, much of its repertoire features the juxtaposition of electronic rhythms and comparatively epic song lengths, leading into its practical function as dance music. The characteristics of disco never quite disappeared from mainstream popular music, instead resurfacing every few years without ever reaching the same ubiquity as its appeal during the genre's peak in the 70s. Outside of music, the 70s prospered with advancements in women's rights, and many of these victories were predicated on the civil rights movements of the 60s, which saw years of widespread protests and demonstrations engender the acquisition of voting, education, and workplace rights for non-white Americans. Future decades of American history would reveal the progressive push of the 70s as long-term and impactful, and with many of these victories attributed to the aforementioned civil rights movement, as well as the explosion of second-wave feminism. Second-wave feminism's impact in the U.S. largely took effect after Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique. Betty Friedan pushed for women's re-entry into the workforce to the point of financial independence, as well as the need to liberate their identity from their husbands and children in order to find personal fulfillment in arts or careers. She also highlighted an unfulfilling relationship to sex many women have, particularly when centering their entire life's fulfillment on it. Such claims would fuel the sexual revolution of the 60s that extended through the 80s, even dawning the golden age of porn. While the movement was tentatively queer inclusive at first, no thanks to Friedan herself, the Stonewall riots in 1969 solidified the newfound emphasis on queer sex and liberation, which continued the challenge to male heterosexuality, whose exclusivity dominated the arts and culture theretofore. As a result, more explicit sexual imagery with a heavy emphasis on full-body sensuality fertilized the music of this rapidly changing culture, particularly in the subcultures that contributed to disco. I restate, culture and art eternally reflect one another. Therefore, the changing attitudes towards sexuality and gay liberation must be uncoincidentally linked to the change in the public's appetite for popular music. While academia entertains musicological connections between American popular music and culture, it deprives itself of similar musical theoretical parallels, much less before the 21st century. Fortunately, the extant collection of feminist musical theoretical critiques of the classical canon provide a sufficient enough skeleton upon which I may flesh out my own methodology and analysis. In 1989, Susan McClary published a collection of feminist critiques of classical music entitled Feminine Endings, that was, as she notes, quite radical given her conservative, male-dominated ilk. The book's fifth chapter, Getting Down Off the Beanstalk, examines atypical musical gestures in Janneke van der Velde's Genesis 2 that McClary believes challenge the norms of European classical music, which she characterizes as inherently linked to masculinity, stating, "The principal innovation of 17th century tonality is its ability to instill in the listener an intense longing for a given event, the cadence. It organizes time by creating artificial need. In the real world, there is no one reason why one should crave, for instance, the pitch D. Yet, by making it the withheld object of a musical desire, a good piece of tonal music can, within a mere 10 seconds, dictate one's very breathing. After that need is established, after the listener has been conditioned to experience the unbearable absence of some musical configuration, strive to postpone gratification of that need, until finally delivering the payoff in what is technically called the climax, which is quite clearly to be experienced as metaphorical ejaculation. McClary's description of authentic cadences as an allegory for male orgasm exists within a system of directional tonality that, on the whole, represents conquest-oriented male sexuality. Tonal music, as she states, is part of a larger cultural tendency to organize sexuality in terms of the phallus, to impose and maintain a hierarchy of power based on gender. While she chiefly considers classical music within this particular chapter, many of her claims can be extended to American popular music, a repertoire whose ties to Western classical music originate in the influence of English balladry. This is not to say that the existence of cadences immediately reveals a culture to be sexist. Instead, I wish to prove that challenging the time-honored tradition of form-functional cadence reflects the social challenge against masculinity as the dominant force in culture. My primary aim is to show that the cultural impact of second-wave feminism and related cultural movements, particularly the increased focus on femininity and sexuality, engendered a loss of tonal directionality and the consequent queering of sexual metaphor in American popular music from the 1950s to the 1960s. I do not mean to propose some previously unearthed March of Progress-esque evolution from ballads to disco. Rather, I wish to speculate how a change in public ideology afforded immense popularity over a relatively short period of time to musics that are increasingly dissimilar in harmony and form to American popular music. Akin to the explosion of interest in national diverse styles during the Romantic era, disco is merely one of many emerging genres, each with their own distinct appeal and cultural significance. Among these styles, disco is the most often credited as queer, feminine, and sexually free, hence its relevance to feminist thought. The importance of black composers, performers, DJs, and music consumers cannot be understated in the evolution of disco. With that said, blackness in itself is not unique to disco. Instead, what distinguishes its influence on disco to contemporary genres is its intersectionality with femininity and queerness, two qualities seldom present in mid-century American popular music. Early American popular music as an industry began in the 1880s as an extension of the English ballad tradition. Harmonically, ballads maintained the European classical ideal in directional tonality with tonic predominant dominant syntax. The 50s fostered the radical shift in diversification of jazz, blues, country, and rock, and would witness the USA's first categorical pop music, including a style to which I refer as traditional pop. Traditional pop begins during the last few years of the Great American Songbook, from 1914 to 1950, and indicated a shift toward ensembles that feature singers over band leaders. While some may see traditional pop as a compositional style, I regard it as a calcification of the compositional style, specifically that of Tin Pan Alley songs and show tunes. Despite its similarities to jazz standards, the influence of contemporary jazz music became watered down in the 50s. As Simon Frith would note of much of pop music, it is essentially conservative. Pop is about giving people what they already know they want. It's unobtrusive. Examples of traditional pop extend far into the 60s, but I place an end date around 1964, at which point the top charts were consumed by Motown Records and the British invasion, as well as the existing surge of American rock music. These two styles of American popular music, disco and traditional pop, collectively straddle the height of second-wave feminism and related movements and mirror each other in their historical flanking of rock music. Disco was to rock as rock was to traditional pop, the new dynasty of popular music whose symbiosis with a vastly evolving culture would innovate the art of music as a whole. After all, the America that fell in love with the dulcet tones of Frank Sinatra was far from the one that shook its ass to Love You Baby while railing a line of coke in a Studio 54 bathroom. On the other side of a newly awakened racial and gender consciousness, the United States no longer found art in rehashing the harmonic and formal music traditions that originated in Reconstructionist-era minstrel shows. No, it yearned for a new type of music that was willing to challenge the white masculinity that dominated the history of the Billboard charts. Disco would sate this yearning. Chapter 2, Methodology. In order to establish a relationship between second-wave feminism and the use of form and harmony in American popular music, I will first establish the norms of traditional pop from 1954 to 1963, before the advent and popularization of second-wave feminism, and highlight its resemblance to common practice era musics. Then, I will contrast this with examples of disco from 1974 to 1979, that no longer follow the same harmonic and formal trends. The end date of 1979 corresponds to a peak and near immediate decline in disco. There we go. In the American cultural climate, sorry, Mitch. With watershed events including the Disco Sucks campaign, which was real, culminating in Disco Demolition Night in July 12th, in which tens of thousands of White Sox fans brought disco records to be publicly set on fire in Comiskey Park Stadium in Chicago. A year later saw a glaring decrease of disco records in the Billboard Top 100 that continued through the 80s. Pieces from both time periods will be analyzed based on their adherence to tonal norms, specifically according to William Kaplan's description of form-functional harmony and cadences as described in The Classical Cadence, Conceptions and Misconceptions. Kaplan breaks down these harmonic progressions into three categories: prolongational, sequential, and cadential. Which serve beginning, medial, and ending function, respectively. Furthermore, he observes that a hierarchy of cadences and the exploration of subordinate keys are necessary to the organization of Western classical music. Any cadence within either dataset will be categorized crudely into one of three tiers. At the bottom, and most general, lies any cadence that is not within the tonic key, irrespective of mode or cadence type. The middle tier is a weak cadence in the tonic key, such as a half cadence, or deceptive cadence. Atop the highest tier rests the authentic cadence in the home key. Within this repertoire, the distinction between perfect and imperfect typically does not matter. I expand the definition of authentic cadence to include other phenomena that imply or modify the 5/1 harmonic resolution. One that is quite common in early popular music involves an interpolation of the 4 chord, interpolation of the 4 chord. Or a diatonic step downward. Under a microscope, this may resemble the 4/1 resolution of a plagal cadence. However, it typically serves the same closing function classical authentic cadences offer, which plagal cadences do not. Hence, I prefer the term gradual authentic cadence. Walter Everett notes the origins of this cadence within the blues tradition, whose 12-bar form often ends with a 5-4-1. All variations of authentic cadences offer the same harmonic and formal closure within this repertoire, and therefore will be treated identically at the top of the cadential hierarchy. Form requires a more nuanced analysis and comparison. Jason Sumack's 2012 dissertation, Form in Top 20 Rock Music, 1959 to 1989, 55, 89, different time, okay, provides a fashionable wardrobe with which to dress these American pop songs. Sumack's categorization of rock songs into strophic songs, AABA ballad songs, and verse-chorus songs robustly fits my 2 datasets. Each letter within a given song type represents a discrete and separable module, usually ranging from 8 to 16 bars. Strophic songs are the most simple, as they are monomodular and feature only strophes. Basically one music idea, right? The verse of Silent Night just kind of repeats with different words. It's the same thing. And the more complex AABA adds a bridge that typically moves from subdominant to dominant before the return of the tonic. Verse-chorus form may also sport a bridge as well as a pre-chorus or post-chorus, making it the most complex. Songs from both datasets will feature modulations that I will categorize into 2 large groups: the diatonic modulation, and the truck driver gear shift modulation. The former represents a modulation between closely related keys. The latter group has been in the pop handbook since the industry's inception and polarizes music theorists who try to interpret into it a tonal system. I suggest a loose constructionist approach that views these modulations as an extension of the home key, not a departure from which. I view this modulation as a stylistic choice to add excitement within a more repetitive repertoire that has no inherently negative impact on the tonality of a song. Take Sunny by Bobby Hebb, for example, which features a strophic form with 5 strophes. While the first 2 strophes are within the same key, E minor, each consecutive strophe gear shifts up 1/2 step. However, the circle of fifths harmony that directs the final 5/7 of each strophe remains the same. There's no set end key. Compared to diatonic modulations that specifically offer the piece a teleology away from and back to the home key. While the diatonic modulations exist for the primary purpose for the listener to remember the home key and await its arrival, gear shift modulations entirely supplant the home key and the listener's desire for its return. Instead of a new key, I view said modulation as an excited state of the home key. According to quantum mechanics, stay with me. According to quantum mechanics, an electron that receives enough energy will enter an excited state without compromising its identity within the atomic system, merely its position. Using this, a piece that modulates from C to C sharp essentially stays within the same key, just an excited state of it. Because one cannot hand a jazz band chords in excited states, I will not analyze anything in a theoretical excited E major. You're welcome. I will still often refer to these modulations as shifts as a means to reclaim the term while distancing it from diatonic modulations. I close my methodology by checking back in with Beyonce, this time far before Renaissance was even a twinkle in the eye of her production team. On his personal YouTube channel, internationally acclaimed producer DJ Swivel recounts his time recording Love on Top, the most infamous use of multiple gear shifts in recent history. The original composition featured a single half-step shift before fading out. While recording takes of this song, Beyonce asked to do another take, but an additional half step higher. Swivel tentatively acquiesced before the pop star asked for yet another take. Then another. Then another. Fielding Swivel's concerns for her health, Beyonce switched to her head voice for the 6th take before saying she could easily do 3 more. At this point, Swivel told her 5 modulations was enough, to which she concurred before they released the song to international renown and Grammy success. The recording process of Love on Top reveals the gear shift modulation as an active fight against goal orientation across keys. The composition itself became malleable to the whims of the performer. 1 modulation was written, the final recording had 4, Swivel recounted there being 6 takes, and Beyonce suggested 3 more on top of that. Does any single shift indicate a more perfect final key than another? Certainly not. As a result, the piece's end, its formal goal, becomes incidental, unimportant. Such directionlessness in form originated far before Beyonce's time. In fact, it would first flourish in the disco music of the 70s as a direct rebellion against the music of the preceding decades. Chapter 3, Analysis. In his description of pop music as the sentimental song, Simon Frith mentions 2 landmark pieces in the American popular music canon. Moon River, from Breakfast at Tiffany's, performed by Audrey Hepburn, and I Will Survive, by Gloria Gaynor. Their release dates are squarely before and after the advent of second-wave feminism, which had greatly shifted the political landscape in the time between. As a result, the pieces they perform reflect the starkly different times. Winner of the 1962 Grammy for Record and Song of the Year, Moon River features a slightly modified 32-bar ballad that I'll call AA Prime. Throughout both halves, there is a general trend of tonic function harmonies that lead into sequential harmonies that remarkably meld with cadential harmonies. Despite a light blurring of these progressions, the order Kaplan proposes is maintained, as is the directionality to which they all contribute.
Moon River, wider than a mile, I'm crossing you in style someday. Oh, dream
antecedent of A ends on the half cadence in the sixth, before the consequent ends on another half cadence, but this time in the tonic key. A prime begins and cadences identically within its own antecedent before its consequent dramatizes the five before a gradual, authentic cadence to close the piece. There is a distinctive hierarchy among these cadences, with the perfect authentic cadence at top, followed by the half cadence in the home key, which itself sits atop the half cadences in the submedian. In fact, this hierarchy provides the piece with a teleology, a direction from the home key before finally concluding in the home key again. Nearly 2 decades later, an equally lauded song would illuminate just how far popular music had changed in such a short time.
At first I was afraid, I was petrified. Kept thinking I could never live without you by my side. But then I spent so many nights thinking how you did me wrong, and I grew strong. From outer space, just walking to find you here with that sad look upon your face. Should I change? I still belong. I should have made you leave it here. If you know for just 1 second, you'll be back to bother me. Don't wanna go, walk out the door, just turn around now, 'cause you're not welcome anymore. What you want, try working with fire, and I crumble. You think I'll lay down and die? Oh no, not I will survive. Oh, as long as I know how to love, I know I'll stay alive. I've got all my life to give, and I got all my love to give, and I'll survive. I will survive. Hey, hey.
I Will Survive by Gloria Gaynor won the first and only Grammy for Best Disco Song in February 1980, and features a composition that is completely unlike the earlier Moon River. The entire piece develops over top of a semi-fifth sequence in A minor with no harmonic or formal demarcation between any formal section. Without any desire to explore or conquer other keys, Gaynor's groove charms the listener while entirely within A minor. The sequence itself offers little tonal directionality. Instead, the piece aims to repeat cyclically forever.
It took all of the strength you felt to fall apart. Kept trying hard to mend pieces of my broken heart. But then I spent so many nights, pieces of free for myself. I used to cry, and now I'm laid out and dying through love. I will survive. I'm not a change, a little person still loving you. It felt like dropping, just expect me to be free. Well, now I'm saving all my love for someone to love me. Go on and go. I will survive. Just stay around now, 'cause you're not welcome anymore. What you want, try to hurt me with your fight. You think I crumble, you think I'll lay down and die. Oh, no, no.
Kaplan would describe sequential progressions as this as medial function. Yet, how can this sequence be medial if it has neither preceding nor subsequent material to clarify the direction of the harmony or cadence? One might consider the end of each 8-bar phrase as a half cadence, indicated by the double-length 5 chord. However, there's no greater organization of said harmony, unless the entire piece is considered to be over a dozen antecedents played consecutively. Rather, the direction of this harmony is identical to the vinyl that houses it, circular.
Go on now, go. Walk out the door. Just turn around now. Well, you're not welcome anymore. What you want, try to hurt me with your body. You think I'll crumble. You think I'll lay down and die.
As Moon River and I Will Survive examined the twilight of traditional pop and disco respectively, I would now like to explore both styles while they were still dawning within the realm of American popular music. Considering both examples thus far feature descending fifths, I put forward Mr. Sandman by the Chordettes, which features prevailing and very tonally employed descending fifths throughout its strophes. Topping the charts in both 1954 and 1955, Mr. Sandman, like Moon River, is split into two halves, this time with 8-bar modulatory interludes between strophes. Each strophe begins on the tonic before the descending fifth sequence begins with the 5-7 of 3. Despite ending on a 5, like both the verse and chorus of I Will Survive, the half cadence in A is prepared by a 1 and a German augmented 6, which offers a more distinct cadential function. Stemming from the chordette's roots in barbershop, nearly every chord in the sequence is an applied dominant that resolves to its respective tonic. To further cement its relationship to tonality, A prime sees the sequence begin anew, before eventually cadencing with a hierarchically superior authentic cadence.
Mr. Sandman, bring me a dream. Make him the cutest that I've ever seen. Give him 2 lips like roses and clover. Then tell him that his lonesome nights are over. Sandman, I'm so alone. Don't have nobody to call my own. Please turn on your magic beam. Mr. Sandman, bring me a dream.
Coinciding with its directional harmony, the chordettes demonstrate a distinctly European bloodlust to conquer other keys. Hear the entire second strophe. Okay, that read well. Great. Here, the entire second strophe takes place in the 4 with otherwise unchanged harmonies.
Mr. Sandman, bring me a dream. Make him the cutest that I've ever seen. Give him the word that I'm not a rover. Then tell him that his lonesome nights are over. Sandman, I'm so alone. Don't have nobody to call my own. Please turn on your magic beam. Mr. Sandman, bring me a dream. Bum 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 bum.
The following interlude gives a cheeky Mozartian modulation before confirming the key with the same harmony as the intro. The final strophe, in essence, acts as a recapitulation of the first strophe in the home key, with the same half cadence followed by the authentic cadence as before.
Mr. Sandman, bring us a dream. Give him a pair of eyes with a come hither gleam. Give him a lonely heart like Pagliacci, and lots of wavy hair like Liberace. Mr. Sandman, someone to hold would be so peachy before we're too old. So please turn on your magic beam. Mr. Sandman, bring us, please, please, please. Mr. Sandman, bring us a dream.
Just like Moon River, there is the same hierarchy of cadences, with the half cadence and authentic cadence in the 4 below the half cadence in the 1, which itself is ultimately subordinate to the final authentic cadence. Mr. Sandman represents an early version of classical pop music that snugly fits the stylistic box in terms of defining harmony, form, and cadence direction. Thus, an exploration of early disco should just as well clarify the genre's own relationship with harmony and cadence. First appearing in its current iteration around 1972, disco had its first radio successes 2 years later, ironically as a pair of rock songs. George McRae's Rock Your Baby and Hughes Corporation's Rock the Boat. It's time to address the elephant in the room. The two datasets so far possess a large formal disparity that markedly impacts their relationship to tonality. The traditional pop tunes have been 32-bar ballads, while the disco songs have all been verse-chorus. Thus, a more balanced comparison must be had in comparing like forms to each other. Before comparing previously undiscussed forms, I will briefly analyze a traditional pop tune the same form as many disco tracks. Que Sera Sera, Whatever Will Be, 1956, by Doris Day represents the vast minority of verse-chorus popular songs before 1963 and is certainly among the most decorated, winning the 1956 Academy Award for Best Original Song and reaching number 2 on the Billboard Top 100.
When I was just a little girl, what she said to me. Que sera, sera. Whatever will be, will be. The future's not ours to see. Que sera, sera.
16 measures in length, the verse is directly bisected by a half cadence that is completed by a perfect authentic cadence by its end.
When I was just a child in school, I asked my teacher, what should I try? Should I paint pictures? Will I sing songs? This was her wise reply. Que sera, sera. Whatever will be, will be. The future's not ours to see. Que sera, sera.
An equally cadence-directed chorus immediately follows before likewise cadencing within 16 measures. However, the phrase is extended by 4 measures through cadential repetition.
Que sera, sera. Whatever will be, will be. The future's not ours to see. Que sera, sera. What will be, will be.
Doris Day demonstrates the compulsion on hierarchical cadences within popular music composition, regardless of form. By the 70s, 32-bar ballads had become scarce, especially within the ilk of disco. That is, aside from 2 shining exceptions. Got to Be Real by Cheryl Lynn and Heart of Glass by Blondie. As a punishment for their ballad form, Blondie fans, okay. As a punishment for their ballad form, both songs necessarily feature some harmonic teleology, albeit with their own rebellious methods of disrupting the norm. The horn line, recognizable from outer space, Got to Be Real immediately blasts off, blending into a syncopated chord that dominates most of the song. Cheryl Lynn does everything in her power to weaken the included 5-1 motion, not only placing it in the middle of the phrase, but also syncopating the arrival of the G minor chord with a 16-note anticipation phrase. The B section of Got to Be Real happens twice, both with identical harmonies that fulfill Sumac perspective, predominant to get bound.
What a find.
direct comparison to Got to Be Real, I offer the Shirelles version of Will You Love Me Tomorrow?
Tonight you're mine completely. You give your life so sweetly. Tonight the light of love is in your eyes. But will you love me tomorrow? Is this a lasting treasure, or just a moment's pleasure? Can I believe the magic of your sighs? Will you still love me tomorrow?
Notwithstanding ballad form, the songs share few harmonic and formal cues, all of which are localized in the bridge. The Shirelles follow the time-honored 4-5 harmonic direction of the bridge that, unlike in Got to Be Real, does resolve to an expected one chord at the beginning of the following final strophe.
Tonight with words unspoken, you say that I'm the only one. But will my heart be broken when the night meets the morning sun?
A more fruitful contrast lies between the song's strophes, where the Shirelles adhere to the directionality of tonic predominant dominant tonic exclusively before cadencing with a 4-5-1, an authentic cadence, at the end of each phrase.
I'd like to know that your love is love I can be sure of. So tell me now, and I won't forget. Will you still love me
If I'm allowed a soapbox, I claim the difference in adherence to tonal harmony and form reflect two vastly different portrayals of young love, according to female singers in these two styles separated by the advent of second-wave feminism. On one side, we have a quartet of women anxiously awaiting a response from a man who may easily break their hearts with a simple, "No, I will not still love you tomorrow." On the other, we have a boisterous young girl belting her shared love for her partner while playing an active role in her relationship. My love is your love, our love is here to stay. Without the need for permission or confirmation from the narrative's male character, Got to Be Real also lacks the tonal confirmation of a key, or even the need to remain within one. Their love is here to stay, regardless of key. Conversely, the Shirelles continually and one-directionally reaffirm their key just as they do their feelings toward an unnamed suitor. McClary might argue of their music what Frieden might argue of their love lives, largely reliant on and boxed in by masculinity and male sexuality. By the end of the 70s, disco had exploded in large part due to the three Gibb brothers, or more widely known as the Bee Gees. By the late 70s, the Gibb brothers were inherently linked to the genre of disco, scoring the massive success Saturday Night Fever in 1977, and constituting half of the top 10 Billboard Hot 100s in 1978. While it is difficult to argue their whiteness or heterosexuality has an intrinsic effect on their music, neither are avoidable when discussing the success is even greater when compared to previously mentioned black and or female disco acts, as well as queer names within the dance music community who received much less mainstream success, such as Sylvester and the Village People. The fact remained that disco had become a global phenomenon to white and straight audiences after the release of Saturday Night Fever, and the Bee Gees and their music played a pivotal role in this development. With successes including Dive Talkin', Tragedy, Night Fever, and How Deep Is Your Love, the Bee Gees had, as Sumac notes, a particular passion for the verse chorus form, despite their scarcity in the disco repertoire. I wish to explore an even more adored verse chorus form to their arguably greatest hit, Staying Alive, which features both a pre-chorus and a post-chorus. With Ease in tow, the song features 4 modules: verse, pre-chorus, chorus, and post-chorus, in that order.
Tell by the way I use my walk, I'm a woman's man, no time to talk. Music loud and women warm, I've been kicked around since I was born. But alright, it's okay, you may look the other way. You can try, you wanna stand, you don't have to make some man. Tell you another man, you stay alive, you stay alive. You stay alive, stay alive. Stay alive.
Because these modules alternate between showcasing the tonic or subdominant harmonies, there is little indication of cadence. The only 5 chord at the end of each chorus is a minor 7, whose modality and lack of predominant preparation ruins the sense of cadence. Instead, what distinguishes each section is the extremely catchy melody, with 4 equally successful earworms, and what connects the modules is the constant percussion and bass-led grooves. Particularly when contrasted with preceding melodic material, and says that opening melodic ideas are typically the most melodically distinct. Thus, a deviation from cadence-based form necessarily deviates from intentionally formulaic melodic closure, and permits freedom for the melody to stay in this state of high distinction. Without a rigid frame to construct a melody, there is a much larger space for creativity in gesture and composition, and the piece may center itself around other forms of organization, such as rhythmic repetition and the percussion and bass, both of which define disco itself.
Stay alive.
Thus far, I have intentionally ignored one particularly famous group in the realm of disco. Any guesses? Swedish pop icons ABBA. First reaching international acclaim after winning the 1974 Eurovision Song Contest, they eventually became popular in gay scenes for their focus on flamboyant femininity. However, this femininity seems to end in their performance acts, as their music they made is anomalously cadence-directed and goal-oriented within the disco repertoire. Waterloo, ABBA's first major success, Eurovision submission, features a verse-chorus bridge model. As with Moon River, the song's two modules may be divided into halves, both of which end in a cadence. As with early American popular music, there is a defined hierarchy of cadences, which is extremely atypical for disco. Fortunately, for the sake of my thesis, Waterloo is not disco. It's a driving rock song. However, it established much of ABBA's harmonic proclivities that would persist through their stylistic evolution to disco. Oh, okay. 2 years after Waterloo, ABBA would release its largest hit in the US, Dancing Queen, which went #1 in over 10 countries upon its release in 1976. Continued analysis of ABBA's repertoire of disco hits unveils a trend of cadence-directed harmony and form and directional harmony. I view this difference as a metaphorical Swedish accent in their songwriting. Instead of experiencing the creation of disco from its founding producers and writers, ABBA receives their influence secondhand from across the Atlantic. Despite the influence from early disco, ABBA's Dancing Queen employs none of its means to diminish the potential effect of the dominant, and instead fall back on the harmonic language of their early pop career. all the way from Sweden. This prompts the question, what causes ABBA's music to feature such idiosyncratic writing? One rather undercritical assumption could be that the songwriters simply preferred the sound of their harmony as they had written in earlier songs, now with a new coat of rhythmic paint. But perhaps their Scandinavian art reflects their Scandinavian culture. Post-World War II, the Swedish government promoted economic stability and equality, and these left-wing policies would extend past the 70s. Needless to say, the United States would spend its resources quite differently. With gender and racial inequity at the forefront of many new radical thinkers and writers, including Malcolm X, James Baldwin, and of course, Betty Friedan, the cultural shift the US underwent in the 60s was far more extreme than that of Sweden's pre-existing egalitarian views within a racially homogenous population. I may speculate that ABBA's idiosyncratic dissimilarities from American disco could represent a deeper disconnect from American culture. Disco originated in the US and is therefore, by definition, an American art form. Accordingly, to discover what it takes to make bona fide American art, we must begin by scrutinizing the culture from which it originates. Chapter 4. Yeah, I'm gonna see the title. Oh. It's a long title. The Queering of Sexual Metaphor in American Popular Music. Thanks, Nick. Give it up for Nick. I have thus far described male sexuality quite vaguely, as McClary herself is generally non-specific in her own classification outside of large gestures of goal orientation and conquering. I wish to classify and specify its definition. First, and most importantly, male sexuality does not broadly refer to any and all sexuality experienced by a man, but rather the specific one-directional cat-and-mouse sexual conquest, often accompanied by ideation of hegemonic masculinity. Such conquest emphasizes an automatic and exclusive division of masculine and feminine, active and passive, conqueror and conquered, and has been present in Western society and arts for centuries. Sexuality as conquest first appeared in the Americas as early as the arrival of Iberian conquerors, who were quite distasteful of men in receptive sexual environments, and used feminizing language as pejorative to the subject of their conquering, the Native American peoples. Foucault traces this relationship between power and sex throughout Western history. He blames the formation of monarchy in the Middle Ages, with its interlocking and conflicting sources of power, for the creation of laws that regulate boundaries of power into a more organized hierarchy. These laws eventually expanded to dictate bodily autonomy, impacting humans' relationships to sex. Simone de Beauvoir contextualizes the power dynamics between sexes in 1949, stating, "Man becomes attached to woman, not to enjoy her, but to enjoy himself. Being indestructibly superior of male, he..." I fucked up that. Oh! Let's hear that one more time. Man becomes attached to woman, not to enjoy her, but to enjoy himself. Being absolutely inferior, women's existence brings out into relief substantial, essential, and indestructible superiority of male without risk. However, she details a coyness in response to this power imbalance. Masculine arrogance provokes feminine resistance. Women is no more a mere pretext than she is man's prey, referring to the entire phenomenon as a virility-femininity circuit. These words would preempt the global spread of second-wave feminism, and with it, a deconstruction of the sexual conquest. Thus signals our timely return to McClary's 1989 publication of Feminine Endings, in which she confronts the musical great-great-grandson of this conquest-based sexuality described by Foucault. Each chapter highlights a different aspect of this power dynamic in music, notably that in Western music culture, music itself is always in danger of being regarded as the feminine other, that circumvents reason and arouses desire, hence the ongoing academic struggle to control music objectively. The most relevant to me of McClary's claims involves her description of male sexuality in music as how very programmed we are to desire violent annihilation through the tonal cadence. And our frustration at not attaining the promised catharsis reveals to us the extent to which we are addicts in need of a fix. Her description is categorically reductive, but so too is this interpretation of male sexuality when postulating at the bevy of sexual expressions and power dynamics available to anyone. Another renowned second-wave feminist, though much more radical, Audre Lorde, describes some of the many possible alternative interpretations of sexuality, stating, The erotic functions for me in several ways, and the first is providing the power which comes from sharing deeply any pursuit with another person. The sharing of joy, whether physical, emotional, psychic, or intellectual, forms a bridge between the sharers which can be the basis for understanding much of what is not shared between them, and lessens the threat of their difference. Another important way in which the erotic connection function is the open and fearless underlining of my capacity of joy, in the way my body stretches to music and opens into response, hearkening to its deepest rhythms, so every level upon which I sense also opens to erotically satisfying experiences, whether it is dancing, building a bookcase, writing a poem, examining an idea. Her connection to music and dance is far from incidental and aligns with the bodily pleasure that didn't revolve around genital sex that corresponds to the descriptions of disco, both the music and the venue. Tim Lawrence writes, music and sex had become part of the same exploratory continuum. Sex positivity defined gay spaces, including discotheques and bathhouses. Lawrence writes, there is no question that sex was the reason for gay men being there. But the dancing became increasingly important. More than anything else, dancing was the activity that brought these people together. He adds, there can be little doubt that gay men, along with women, were the key protagonists of the 1970s disco culture because they were less invested than the straight men in holding on to their dominant form of the autonomous, rational, masculine self. Sensuality and a connection to music and dance had become an important outlet of sexuality in the 70s and threatened the dominance of conquest-based male sexuality. It would be equally reductive for me, male body notwithstanding, to oust a metaphorical male sexuality in tonal music in favor of a similarly abstracted female sexuality in dance music, whose composers, performers, etc. are far less monolithic than those who created the tonal system dance music usurps. Furthermore, the idea of a female sexual metaphor would simply uphold the same false binary that generated the power imbalance within the described male sexuality. Historically, the dominant chord has functioned as a harbinger of teleology within a popular song, particularly for its role in a half cadence as well as its penultimate role in other cadences. I've shown that as the 20th century progressed, this cadential dominant in American popular music appeared less frequently, in many cases not at all, or in a less dramatized form. My claim is that disco's perverted usage, and lack thereof, of the dominant harmony when compared to early American popular musics has thus queered this dominant chord, according to McClary's metaphorization of tonality as male sexuality. Before continuing, I would like to make an extended comparison of this usage of the dominant to the courtship practices of mid-century. Going steady had become the leading form of courtship in post-war US, replacing the pre-war dating practice of largely unserious yet frequent dates with many members of the opposite sex. A 1964 paper by sociologist Thomas Poffenberger captures the explosion of this pattern of dating in high school and college participants. Late study centuries have shown a decline in this behavior in the 70s and 80s, during and after the heyday of disco, indicating the culture's decoupling of sex and relationships that had gone steady. One can view going steady as a teleological form of dating. In fact, the 1964 study includes an entire section entitled Going Steady in High School as Goal-Oriented Behavior. Within this system, we may jocularly consider these dates as a platonic prolongation, music joke, before the awaited cadence of marriage and union of resources for the express purpose of rearing offspring. Just as tonality as a system was constructed after centuries of non-harmonically directed modal counterpoint, going steady follows decades of non-goal-oriented dates that served a multitude of other purposes than portending marriage. Nearly all of the traditional pop songs in the analysis, Will You Love Me Tomorrow, Mr. Sandman, Que Sera Sera, exemplify this phenomenon of monogamous love being described over directional harmony and cadence-directed form. Moon River itself is a thinly veiled metaphor for the singer's lover, and every 8 measures, the listener is cadentially reminded of the large-scale goal of harmony and form, which is for the singer to finally reach the union of Moon River and me, an exclusive pair of lovers. Considering the decline of going steady and the corollary decline of directional harmony, one may easily abstract goal-oriented relationships in pursuit of sex onto goal-oriented roles of the dominant in pursuit of cadence. Contrapositively, a lack of direction in a music may correspond to a lack of goal orientation within a romantic or sexual interaction between partners. Now to explore the implications of such a claim. My analysis has shown that disco music, generally, avoids tonal directionality. This discussion aims to link disco music to its surrounding culture, which avoids immediate associations between sex and monogamous relationships. Continuing the discussions of clubs and bathhouses, disco-goers engaged in non-monogamous sex in ways that unswaddled the mindset of reproduction as paramount and instead allows building of community and sexual experience, among other things. The culture's relationship to sex has been queered, as has the music's harmonic and cadential relationship to the dominant. Note my choice of the term queering of the dominant, as opposed to the neutering, castration, emasculation, etc. A shift away from conquest-driven sexuality does not make it weaker or lesser, nor must it become less masculine. Reducing directionality within music does not force its asexuality. Merely it opens music's metaphorical heart to other forms of love and affection. In fact, certain disco songs emblematize a newfound willingness to alternate between multiple methods of attraction. Take, for example, Got to Be Real, which unilaterally features a directional harmony toward a cadential dominant in the bridge, yet lacks harmonic direction elsewhere. This blending of cadences and non-cadence-based modules may suggest a relationship in which the idea of conquest may be present, but exists in flux with other forms of intimacy and power dynamics to produce a more complex connection between partners. That the dominant no longer exhibits primarily cadential function comprises but half the journey. While not completely absent, or perhaps abstinent, the 5 chord has been liberated from its rigid form-functional prison so that it may now serve one of many functions within a song. No longer must the 5 appear as a major triad or dominant 7th to offer importance to a composition, but instead it may appear as a minor triad or 7th, or even without a third altogether, at times frequently. McClary recounts the historical importance of the major 5 by listing theorists who delineate major and minor chords by their alleged masculinity and femininity, respectively. Georg Andreas Sorge directly states, "And just as the womanly sex without the man would be quite bad, thus with music, if we had no other harmony than that which the minor triad gives, we could not make an authentic cadence." In a post-cadential repertoire, the masculine desire for conquest of the dominant gives way for a minor feminization of the 5. This minor 5 chord corresponds to an increased incidence of minor triads within the disco repertoire. On the other side of the rock-disco divide, much of the blues rock repertoires, which Richard Dyer considers phallocentric, include songs that feature major-only harmonies as well as an overall preference for major triads. Compare this to I Want Your Love by Chic, led by disco legend Nile Rodgers, which features verses that loop A minor and E minor 7s as an interplay between minor tonic and dominant without any outside harmonies. Sister Sledge, a group made of 4 sisters, released He's the Greatest Dancer in 1979, also written and produced by Nile Rodgers. The verses loop G minor 7, C minor 7, and D minor 7, whose minor exclusivity is quite eye-catching. This piece, just like I Want Your Love, was not written to require a major 5, or any form of cadence, so the groove continues until the song fades out. Seemingly in response to Sorge's remarks against the self-sufficiency of feminine harmonies, the 4 Sledge sisters parade an independence of minor triads that equals their own sexual independence as they reverse the roles of standard sexual conquest and rhapsodize about the male subject of their attraction. In addition to this frequent feminization, the dominant is often maintains its masculine form as a major triad or dominant 7th. However, instead of changing its internal properties, chord quality, the dominant now is queered through context and use. Certain disco songs upset the expectation of a strong cadential resolution and simultaneously tease the listener and dominant chord alike. While deceptive, abandoned, or evaded cadences exist as formal strategies in the high classical era, these pseudo-cadences point in the direction of a later, non-frustrated cadence. In the dance repertoire, this frustration is a means to dissolve the cadential function of the 5 outright. Rock the Boat offers a particularly egregious example, ending the verse with a non-committal half cadence that reaches formal resolution with an authentic cadence that appears a beat earlier than expected as a result from the sudden measure of 3/4. Repetition as well can enfeeble the dominant's directionality within a cadence, seen in the continuous and indistinguishable half cadences of I Will Survive. This repetition teases the dominant's desire to partake in a hierarchy of cadences it itself dictates, a power it no longer has. I would like to touch upon the increased importance of the subdominant, both major and minor, within this repertoire. Throughout my education, the 4 always seemed like a sort of third gender of harmonies. The 5 was this literal dominant force incessantly chasing after a coyly pursued tonic. How then must we interpret the subdominant chord other than an awkward third wheel on a centuries-long dinner date? No, I do not think the 4 became straighter as the 5 became gayer in a sort of diametric process, nor would I argue that 4 is the new 5. There is no power vacuum through deposition of tyrannical 5, and the tonic is not cheating on the dominant with the 4. Instead, I do believe the two harmonies underwent complementary shifts in their uses over the history of American popular music, resulting in the 5s no longer going steady with the tonic. Heretofore, I have made a case for the dominant's withering stranglehold over harmonic directionality within the disco repertoire, using sexual and romantic metaphor. Therefore, I find the term dominant, which itself is a paper-thin sexual metaphor, increasingly inappropriate to describe its new functions and lack thereof in this music. It is quite transparent that I, within my first graduate-length thesis, will not incite an intergenerational call to arms to change the name of a fixture in music theory. Nevertheless, I would like to briefly scratch my own itch regarding the potential renaming of the 5 chord, if only for entertainment purposes. The passive dominant. Although I deeply appreciate the oxymoron, the false dichotomy it perpetuates dissatisfies me. It's a little too on the nose to the point of pigeonholing. Repurposed, or non-cadential dominant. Either seems like a tantalizing fit, but they still center the original cadential purpose of these harmonies rather than their current use. The versatile dominant. Perhaps just the versatile. A term directly lifted from queer spaces, I find its vagueness to be the point it's trying to make. The 5 no longer serves one purpose, that of cadential direction and harmonic teleology. It is now free to explore other harmonic functions, even to switch roles with the 4, or any harmony that leads to the tonic. Nomenclature notwithstanding, the 5 chord within the disco repertoire flamboyantly flaunts its flagrant harmonic and formal liberation and would go on to flavor all disco influence and disco-adjacent styles of music to the present day. Chapter 5. Conclusion. We now return to the modern day, in which disco's mainstream popularity is once again, for lack of a better word, climaxing. That disco is in, again, prompts many questions. What does that mean of our current culture? What does that mean about our culture's previous iterations in which disco was not in? What does the evolution of disco to house, synth pop, techno, EDM, even hip hop, speak about the evolution to their own contemporary cultures? All that my analysis gives me liberty to say extends from the mid-50s to the late 70s. Between these years, the popular style of music drastically changed in terms of harmony, form, and cadence, as did the culture's views on masculinity and femininity. The 5 chord, once the bearer of directional harmony and signifier of cadence, has been since demoted, and the remaining harmonies dance around it without the need for hierarchical direction. As a result, the disco no longer exhibits the same need for harmonic teleology and cadence direction form as did the traditional pop 20 years its senior. A change in music, an art so tied together with masculine imagery and patronage, may easily represent a change in relationship to the systems of power that controlled this definition. Hence, the long-term effects in social change during second-wave feminism more than historically coincide with the long-term effects of disco on American popular music. They unavoidably influence each other. That disco was ever in permanently changed American popular music. In other words, that disco was ever in permanently changed American art. Therefore, that disco was ever in permanently changed American culture. While this study is far from comprehensive, it has certainly opened Pandora's sexually liberated box. An obvious expansion to this thesis, we got there eventually, to this thesis would be to include other art forms, including dance, fine arts, and film, to potentially observe like-minded shifts across the mid-century. Film, for instance, has already been shown to directly affect the popular culture of disco in the blockbuster release of Saturday Night Fever. I watched Saturday Night Fever for the first time while writing this thesis, and it was simultaneously what I expected and not quite at the same time. The movie holds an odd place in history. It commemorates the art of disco, but only in a way to make it palatable to white audiences in the 70s. I was unsurprised to see white masculinity dominate the film. Women are demeaned, objectified, and assaulted. There are 0 named black characters and very few people of color in the film. No, I'm not counting Italians in the 70s. The only textual queer person is a passing mention of David Bowie, a bisexual man introduced as a half-faggot before having his sexuality described as, yeah, he swings both ways, men and boys. Furthermore, the sexuality explored through the lens of Tony and his 18 to 20-year-old friends is entirely heterosexual, conquest-based, and monogamous. For Christ's sake, the story revolves around a male-female pair dancing competition. The black and gay musicians who contributed to the rise of disco are virtually absent, as are the strong, independent women for whom Frieden yearned. The fact that the Bee Gees of all disco artists were chosen, talented as they are, is entirely uncoincidental. What did surprise me is the characters' exploration of the changing views of sexuality that impacted them and the stand-in middle American audience. Tony and his friends do not view marriage as a goal or dates as a means to marriage. In fact, Tony tells Annette he avoided her because she was only interested in marriage. Sex is brazenly showcased as specifically non-procreative as well. Tony's ex-priest brother even leaves the church specifically to rescind his vow of celibacy. Saturday Night Fever can only communicate the newfound sexual revolution to an audience whose racial and sexual complacency is directly responsible for others to fight for sexual rights and freedoms. Because the black, gay, and female musicians of the cultural impetus appear neither in the film nor its music, the movie depicts a reimagining of disco culture, with exclusively white monogamous straight couples at the forefront. Or rather, it previewed what the dominant culture would soon evolve into and out of over the following years as a result of the film's success. Backlash to this rise of commercial disco is what started the Disco Sucks campaign and led to the flaming pyre of discos during the Disco Demolition Night and the following national decline in record sales that eventually led to the collapse of the genre. Yet, as it burned to the ground, disco planted flowers in the garden of American popular music that still bloom to the present day. And we are all watching and listening to that queer musical phoenix re-beginning its life cycle. Disco is seeing its revival, its rebirth, its renaissance. Thank you. We got one last song for you. And this is dance music, so if you like to dance, it's only appropriate.
My last dance, last chance for love. Yes, it's my last chance for romance to
theory's not so bad. Thank you all so much for coming. Thank you.
Oh my